The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. On this episode, we're looking back at the Indy road course race won by Alex Palou. No, it's not 2023. We are still in 2024. It's just happened again. So we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. We'll also look at the Indy 500, which, spoiler alert, is coming up this week. So, or it's already started happening if you're listening to the episode later than when it's being recorded. But yeah, from Tuesday, the 14th of May, Indy 500 practice will be underway. We will have cars on the oval at the Brickyard, which is very, very exciting. Unlike the last episode where we had interviews with Teo Pourchaire and Colton Herta, go back and listen to those. Teo doing the rest of the season for Aaron McLaren, and Colton was the points leader at the time. I'm sure we'll get into unraveling how he's not the points leader anymore when we look back at the Indy road course race. But yeah, that episode didn't contain JR Hildebrand, so welcome back, JR, after a week off. How are you doing? Are you looking forward to getting stuck into the month of May a bit more now?
I mean, it's obviously I'd rather be out in the car, but I'm planning on heading out there and sort of checking things out. Hopefully, get some things rolling for either later in the year or heading into 2025. And yeah, I mean, it's always exciting when you're going to get cars on track. You know, if you're part of the IndyCar universe, even from where I'm sitting, wishing that I was out there or whatever. It's a time of year that you can sort of count on as like, okay, we're going to do this thing that we're all here. We're going to do the thing that we're all here to do, basically, when the second week of May rolls around. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting. There's, the weather is kind of all over the place this week as it tends to be, but maybe an even greater, like, apparent threat for for weather heading into heading into qualifying weekend. Some risks are there. Somebody's, at least one car is going to go home. I don't know if you have any insight in terms of what's going on with the Abel Anderson, program, but we'll sort of see how that shakes out, whether we've got 30, 34 or 35 cars. But even last year, just that coming down to the wire, and Graham Rahal of all people being the one that ended up not making the show. I think that's all you need to know how tense this can potentially end up being. I don't think there really isn't an obvious weak kind of team within the field. There's a few people that you could few drivers and entries that you could point to and kind of say, okay, odds are maybe less favorable for these folks. But I think last year was a good indicator of the fact that more often than not, it just comes down to somebody who you'd sort of expect to have it together just for one reason or another, whether it's some kind of weird car prep issue or it's something that happens during the week of practice or whatever, ends up being a more decisive factor, heading into these situations. So I think it's one of those things that we talk about. There's obviously been a lot of discussion around this new charter system and however that's going to work out, and whether that's going to include guaranteed entries at the 500, which it seems likely that that's not the case. But whenever it comes, there's an annual discussion from some that is spawned out of some team owner conversation that's happening behind the scenes around guaranteed entries at Indy. And I think just looking to last year and thinking about the amount of drama and tension and the requirement that creates for teams and drivers to bring their A game in this particular high stress scenario where it also happens to match up with the time during the year where the cars are going the fastest they ever go. So it's like, it really is just the perfect combination of the things that make IndyCar, that have always made IndyCar and the Indianapolis 500 great. So qualifying at Indy, so particularly this week, even for me, as a driver, as a fan, is just one of the most interesting and exciting times of the year.
Maybe you'll get a phone call from someone asking if you'll get in their car, and then it won't happen, and that'll kind of be the, because that's never happened before.
That'll become my new tradition, is just getting multiple phone calls about like maybe needing to get in a car and then it not happening. I'm going to try to avoid that for at least a year. Just change it up a little.
Well, we've said this for the last 2 years now, but the Indy 500's loss is definitely our gain. So as much as we are sad that you're not out in a car for the whole of the month of May, at the moment, as things stand, we'll take our pleasures where we can get them and have you on the pod. So that's cool. We'll get more into the Indy 500 a little bit later on. Don't worry if you're a little bit confused or need a bit of a refresher of how the kind of pre-Indy 500 stuff works in terms of the practice and qualifying. We'll give you a little rundown of that as well to remind you in case you're not familiar to it. We obviously welcome all new listeners to the pod. If you're not an IndyCar fan and you're getting into the pod because you're listening for the month of May for the first time, welcome along, and we'll try our best to explain anything. And you can always hit us both up on social media as well to ask questions about anything you're uncertain about over the course of the month of May. So before we get into all of that, we'll just quickly, I guess, recap the Indy road course race. Alex Palou, as I joked at the top of the show, on pole and won, which is what he did in 2023 to start the month of May. A really interesting race in the sense that Christian Lundgaard took the lead at the first corner with a lovely switchback move and was definitely the guy who was going to win the race for a large portion of it. But we kind of had a couple of little things going on in the second pit stop phase, which was Lundgaard and Power catching traffic allowed Alex Palou to close the gap that was probably around 3.5 seconds at that point. So he was allowed to close in. And then we had Will Power bailing to pit early, which took him out of the equation. And then he got caught behind Marcus Ericsson in that round of stops. And while all that was happening, Alex Palou went long and did his usual Chip Ganassi strategy thing where he does either an undercut or, more often than not these days, an overcut, and jumped into the lead, was able to hold on to it even though there was a little bit more to do for the rest of the race, but he seemed pretty comfortable once he got back in the lead later on. JR, I'm really interested in this because I had a quick look at the points, and Alex Palou has 31 more points than he had at this point last year. And knowing what he was able to do in the second half of 2023, it's not filling me with a lot of enthusiasm at this point in time for a good championship battle. I think we have to sort of reference the weird starts of the year that we've had. I guess also Palou won the Indy road course race, which was the 5th round of last year, I think, rather than the 4th. So we're not counting his win from last year in these points. So that's where the kind of points get made up, because we didn't have Texas this year, but we did last year. So there's kind of a race missing in terms of Alex Palou winning a race. And we've also had, obviously, the Penske disqualifications at St. Pete. We've had lots of people just having weird starts to the season, like Pato O'Ward, who was given that win at St. Pete, but has had quite a few poor races since. Colton, who we'll get into a little bit later on, having a tricky race here at the Indy GP, but still managed to bounce back. And people like Will Power, who lost 10 points from that St. Petersburg disqualification incident. But yeah, I mean, how do you feel about the championship at this point? Because I feel like this is the kind of crossover period where we get from it's way too early to talk about the championship to, oh, it's the month of May, like things are seriously kicking off now. And the fact that Palou has, over a race win more points than he did at last year is significant. You have to preface that with the fact that the person behind him has more points. So his championship lead isn't 31 points greater than it was at this point last year, but he has bagged more points. I guess the interesting part for me, JR, is that I feel like he's still gone well under the radar, even though obviously he won the thermal race, but that was non-points, so we didn't get too excited about that. Most of the other races have just been kind of typical strong performances, but nothing that's blown us away like it did last year. And then we get to the Indy GP where he does exactly the same thing as he did last year. So I guess, how are you feeling about where the championship kind of shapes up at the moment and where everyone's at? It's been a really weird start to the year, hasn't it?
I'm feeling glad that I'm not somebody who's having to compete against Alex Palou weekend to weekend. Basically, that's how I'm feeling about
another positive of you not being in the car this weekend, JR.
Yeah. So like, I guess my point of view on the championship really starts and ends with the fact that the championship schedule this year is quite a bit different than it's been in a long time. Which is, we've got these more significant breaks throughout the season, which we've kind of already been through, but we'll get to another one later in the year. And then we close the year out with a bunch of oval tracks, that a couple of which in Milwaukee and Nashville, that very few, I will just say very few of the current drivers and even a lot of the engineers that are in the paddock like haven't been to. And so I think that sort of makes for just a different complexion of how I think this will go. Last year, it basically got to a point where it seemed like a foregone conclusion that Alex Palou had enough of a lead that it just wasn't, there wasn't enough variability in terms of what the races were going to look like for the rest of the season. Once we were at the halfway point, he had won 3 out of 4 or whatever it was, that, there was kind of no obvious weak point or place where he was and he covered those off pretty quickly. Like Iowa was one of the events last year that sort of seemed like, oh, okay, this is a place where Newgarden or Power or somebody could like really claw their way back into this. And it sort of happened, but not at a magnitude that was ultimately meaningful in the big scheme of things. And it didn't really feel meaningful even at the time, because you were just thinking like, oh, okay, whatever. Like Alex just did what he had to do here. He finished on the podium, in the second race at Iowa. It was like, whatever. And so I guess I think this year there's room for there to be more of a shift, regardless of where the points end up. And that the oval tracks are also, I think, typically places that it's easier for like a small mistake that somebody else makes to end up completely ruining your race, which happens a little less, I think, on road and street circuits outside of starts and restarts, basically. So I say all of that mainly, and I mean this is not just to, try to whatever set us up for hoping that there's a more, giving people hope where there's not actually hope for the season to be more interesting, even if Alex Palou goes on like a serious run here. But the flip side to that is he's kind of doing everything that we saw him do well last year. And so he certainly hasn't lost a step. And so I guess I probably where my head is at, honestly, is probably where it was heading into this season, which is somebody else has to step up to the plate and show that they've made a gain to be able to knock Palou off the throne here. Like Alex in this event showcased, and for that matter at Thermal showcased, like in my mind, the main thing that separated him from everybody else, which was that he managed to find a race pace in particular, while being able to look after his tires adequately, that basically just nobody else could match more often than not last year. That didn't result in a race win every time last year, but it was unquestionably his strength. I was sort of texting or messaging back and forth with Oriol Servia a little bit, who's driving the pace car. He and I are buddies that we go way back. That it's kind of this like there's no wasted motion, there's no wasted energy. It's not super flashy from the outside, like the car's not getting chucked around all over the place, but the lap time just shows up, and it shows up every corner, every lap with very little inconsistency and, very little change over time. Like his ability to just put together repeatable laps right on the limit. It's the thing that we've talked about with Scott Dixon as well. Like Scott probably is the most obvious guy to be able to match Alex like punch for punch as we go through the year, because there are some things, as Alex has stated, we talked about that briefly after Long Beach. There are still some things that Scott's better than Alex at, that Alex has even sort of admitted that Scott's better than him at. Scott's also extraordinarily good at this same thing, basically. But the difference between the two of them, at least if we just took the last couple of years, if you didn't read into engineering, you didn't read into team stuff, you didn't read into any of the kind of nuances, which is kind of like, they're not inconsequential. So it's a little unfair to not read into them or not to factor them in. But the reality of it is, for us from the outside, we don't know enough about what's going on or how much it's affecting how any one guy is doing weekend to weekend. Like that depends on like a much more, deeply insightful perspective of what's going on within these teams, which hardly anybody besides the people that are on those teams really have. I think you could probably just say the trend has been that Alex has had just a bit more kind of outright pace, when it has sort of mattered, a bit more outright average pace over the course of race stints, a bit more pace in qualifying, certainly on road and street circuits. Indy, it actually makes the 500 to me sort of pivotal. It's always a pivotal event, but it'll be interesting to see just between the two of them, between Alex and Scott, where do they kind of wind up? And I guess it would be the type of thing that if Scott outperforms Alex over the course of the month of May, to me, that would solidify or give a little bit more juice to what I think is a preconception that I have, which is that Scott's probably going to be on average in a position. He will be able to put himself in a position to be better for that run of ovals at the end of the year. The only other obvious guy to sort of factor in at that point is Newgarden, but he's kind of so far out of the mix right now that it would require more of what has happened in the past, but it will require more of like Dixon and Power and Palou having issues at some point to kind of even them all up going into that final stretch. So I say all of that basically to say I sort of think that you sort of got like the wily vets of Power and Dixon that just thus far have been the ones that have kind of been able to keep tabs on Alex so far this year. They are also the ones that are quite good at the same types of things. Um, and that because they've got just this wealth of experience and probably because of that, like a confidence in their ability to kind of just like stick with it and manage to pull off some, you know, uh, unlikely scenarios and races and have, between they and their teams that they've worked with for a long time, they have a good innate sense of like what they can pull off and what they can't to not end up making like taking silly risks that are like the downside is you're finishing outside the top 15 or something in order to try to claw back some points. Um, to me, the wild card probably is Colton, I guess, just because it seems like Andretti has made a fairly significant step. And I think he's somebody that if the cars are there, I would throw him into the mix of being able to at least definitely pull off the outright pace required to go hunt guys down. So that's my general perspective at this point, just on the overall championship. There's nobody else. There's not really another team driver combo. We could talk about McLaughlin. We could talk about Pato, but there doesn't strike me, certainly outside of that bracket, there doesn't strike me as a really obvious team driver combo that feels like they can collectively fire on all cylinders with the same ceiling as these handful of entries that we've talked about so far.
We know the 500 won't be as pivotal as it has been in the past because there's no double points for the second year in a row, which we can huzzah at JR, which is very enjoyable for us because we hate double points at the Indy 500, or at least I do. I don't know if hate's a too strong a word for you, but I'll use it for myself. Will Power was second, managed to get ahead of Christian Lundgaard after Lundgaard had led so much that race. Bit disappointing, but I think it's a similar situation Lundgaard's been in for a couple of races now. I remember Long Beach as well, hearing him talk about the situation there. He'd finished 23rd there, but I remember him talking in qualifying at Long Beach and basically saying that he was upset that they hadn't got more out of the car, but at the same time they were like light years ahead of where they'd been at the same track the year before, and therefore he had to see it as a bit of a positive. And I think taking a podium in the first Indy road course race, I think that's the first time he's finished that high up in the first Indy road course race of the season since he's been in IndyCar. So that felt like it was significant to him, and he was keen to point out that although they'd obviously missed out on the race win and that he wasn't really happy with the final pit stop, where he felt like he'd lost some time to Power, and where he felt that the team maybe isn't performing at the level of the likes of Penske and Ganassi maybe. He was still pretty pleased with the podium. I think Dixon was fourth, having qualified well, which was always an ominous thing to look at with Scott Dixon. If he's qualifying well, then that takes out a little bit of him having to come from so far back in races and makes him even more of a threat. I'm keen not to run through the whole kind of order here, but there was just some significant people to point out, and they all happen to be pretty much in order. Marcus Armstrong, top 5. He was 5th and scored his best result in IndyCar so far, so that was significant. And Scott McLaughlin was just behind, having won the lotto on his final caution there, where he was already in the pits as the caution came out and was able to come out in 6th and did a great job there. And then Colton was 7th, and that takes us nicely on to the next topic I wanted to get into. Obviously, if you've not listened yet, go back and listen to Colton on the show. He gave some great insight into how he was approaching being the championship leader and how he was approaching being in the championship hunt generally. A little bit about Andretti coming down to 3 cars, and as JR mentioned, them seeming to have found a decent step forward for this season. And even the Indy GP felt like one of those races where it could have all gone very wrong, and it kind of did to a certain extent. But he was able to come back. I guess in context, it was definitely a difficult race for Andretti in the sense that Marcus Ericsson and Kyle Kirkwood to a lesser extent, but was also struggling a little bit with the just general like pace of the car in qualifying, struggling to find what Felix Rosenqvist was able to get out of it, for example. that being significant because Meyerschank's obviously using some of Andretti's equipment. So an interesting one there that Andretti tested at this track and felt like they'd made a bit of a step forward, and then actually turned up at the track and just didn't really have the pace they were really expecting. But Colton in contact with Marcus Ericsson on the first lap, which put Colton off the track and led to an expletive-filled radio message, which he then backed up in a post-race interview as well, which I'm kind of interested to get your thoughts on this, JR, because I kind of have two different thoughts on how Colton's gone about things here. First of all, before we get into that, I should say that he basically ran not huge, but significant kind of undercuts against most of the rest of the field and was able to kind of jump his way up the order. He was 8th at the final restart, managed to pass Alexander Rossi to take 7th, which was an incredible comeback considering he'd had to go not quite to the back of the pack, but pretty much to the back of the pack after Marcus had bumped him off. But yeah, I kind of have two trains of thought on this interview he gave after the race. If you've not heard it yet, you can go back and listen on social media. It's IndyCar, I've shared it on Twitter, but he basically calls Marcus Ericsson an ass, and says that he was dumb to race him in the way that he did, knowing that he was the championship leader. This kind of stuff, basically. I was really like kind of enjoying that side of Colton. I feel like post-race interview Colton is the best Colton. Like he doesn't hide anything. There's no kind of there's no PR in there. It's just like my heart's on my sleeve and I'm going to say exactly what I think. It reminds me of Thermal.
He's so like matter of fact. Too.
Yeah.
Like it's not even like he's super pissed off. It's almost like I've been thinking about this in the car for the last hour. I just want to say it now. You know?
And like going back to Thermal, after he got out of the car, it was feast or famine, and I was hungry. Like this kind of stuff is awesome. Like he's really got those one-liners down, which is great and something that IndyCar really needs. I feel like I've said this quite a lot of times over the past few years, where I don't feel like we've got enough kind of like driver to driver rivalry. I think that's something we're kind of missing in modern IndyCar that we used to have more of, I think, back in the day, although that might be a bit of a rose-tinted spectacles look at things. But I definitely feel like there was more drivers that hated each other back in the day. But on the other hand, I think Colton's really not made the best decision in what he said here against Marcus, because I think you can accept that Marcus made a big mistake in obviously pushing him off the track. That was not good, and Colton well within his rights to be totally upset at that. There's multiple things you could get upset about Marcus with, whether it was the contact itself or not knowing that it was Colton around him. But he was, quick to say that at least he told me that they'd spoken after the race and that they were kind of cool, and they'd kind of fleshed it out a little bit after the race. But yeah, the thing I didn't really like about this was I felt like Colton had a high road to take here in terms of like he could have just said we'll discuss it internally, like that kind of, I don't want to say famous because that's kind of overplaying it, but when Rossi and Rosenqvist got together at Nashville last year and Rossi had give that kind of half smile and said, we'll discuss it internally, didn't really say anything about the contact. But I just think with this team, it's on such a roll, and I know the results haven't quite, backed it up with the other two cars, but I think you can basically unpick those results as being not fair, basically. Like, I think Kyle could have been quite a bit further forward. And if we've had any criticism of Kyle, it's that he's not been consistent, and he's finished 10th, 7th, 10th and 11th so far this season. So that feels like a massive step forward, even if those results are not where he wants to be finishing and he doesn't have a race win yet like he did last year. It's still a big, tick box for Kyle Kirkwood, being more consistent, getting those good results, basically. Marcus has made a couple of errors, but had that issue in St. Pete where he was running in the top 5 and probably would have been in and around there. Maybe would have even been in contention for a podium or a win after the Penske disqualifications had all played out and we'd actually seen how the race kind of unfolded there. I just feel like Andretti's had some problems before with their kind of driver lineups and trying to keep the harmony there. And I think Colton had an easy way out just to say, we'll not get into that too deeply. And in actual fact, I feel like he made that quite a bit worse by, using the language that he did and kind of flaring that up. But I think the thing that's probably different between the Rossi, Grosjean, Di Francesco and Herta situation that we had at Mid-Ohio in 2022 is that obviously we've got a different lineup here. So you've got Kyle Kirkwood and Marcus Ericsson in there. Don't feel like they're going to, that something like a Colton Herta like post-race press conference is going to be like a TNT explosion that means that those guys just can't get on anymore. I feel like they've made such a step forward with dropping down to 3 cars and just kind of focusing on the 3 entries. And even if the results haven't shown that yet, for at least Kyle and for Marcus, I just feel like that wasn't the wisest decision for Colton to make. There was an easy way out and he didn't take it. But I'm not as worried about the team kind of chemistry as I probably would have been in the past or with other incidents. It felt like more of a kind of a smaller incident that probably won't flare up as big as like something like Mid-Ohio did.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's I think on both fronts, I thought the incident itself didn't really warrant like the reaction or quite the magnitude of the reaction. At least, like,
I would agree.
It warrants being, pissed off about it over the radio briefly after it happens, but I don't know. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. Had it been somebody else, or I don't know. I guess I think that it's like it was a little bit like Marcus last year at Mid-Ohio went and like ended up stuffing it down into Felix on the start, I think. And it reminded me a little bit of, and it's just because it's not necessarily because this is Marcus. It's just because that was another incident of somebody doing a similar thing, that it's like cold tires kind of started the race into a corner where the corner is going away from you and you're like losing grip as you're, bending in and turning and whatever. That it was just a miscalculation, and it happened to be his teammate on the outside of him, that got hosed by it. So I think in the big scheme of things, I'm not sure that I'm feeling like that actually had an enormous impact on Colton's race even. And I would agree that it seemed for that reason, maybe more than anything else in particular, it seemed a little harsh, and that this in other scenarios, this could be the start of, something that boils over a little bit. But I just think between these, I mean, I'm sure Marcus is just like, doesn't care or is already over it or whatever. Like, this just doesn't, we talked about this on the last pod that we were both on, that it just kind of seems like the 3 of these guys, it's just not a formula for having like huge blowups that go unresolved or something. So I'm kind of with you. I think there's probably just a bit of a general frustration that starts to build up of we're not quite executing at the level that maybe they could and that might be required to compete with Alex, the guys that are up at the front of the championship. But I think ultimately it's not a huge deal.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with cash back match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Give us some IndyCar insight into this from a driver's perspective, because when Marcus spoke to me, he said, when I figured out it was him trying to go around the outside, I tried to brake to get out of it, but locked up my front and made contact. So I think Marcus is basically saying by the time he'd figured out it was Colton, he was like trying to bail out of it and messed up basically while he was trying to get out of the way almost. So in Formula One, I think there's a massive tendency for drivers to rely on the team to warn them when drivers, especially in qualifying and practice, I'm thinking of, warn them when drivers are coming up behind them, when they've got people around them and stuff like that. And I know that happens less in a Formula One race. It's probably more of a qualifying thing than it is a race thing. But on a race start, are you kind of expecting the team to come on the radio there and say, Colton's the car behind, like, watch out for him, he's obviously leading the championship at this point? Or is an IndyCar start so messy that you can't really kind of micromanage to the extent of like the car behind you is X? Because I guess you would have the spotter on the radio be like every like 10th of a second saying, this person's behind you, this person's behind you, this person's behind you. I just wondered if the fact that Herta was leading the championship and he was a teammate was significant enough that maybe Andretti could have got on the radio and let Marcus know there.
Yeah, I guess I think that's having the expectation, at least, that you're going to have that info in that kind of a situation. Once you get deeper into the race, once it's more like the field is a little more, isn't shuffling quite as dramatically as it is at the beginning of the race, then you'll get a little bit more insight into who's who.
You can probably work out more for yourself as well. You can see like who's behind you, and you kind of got a better
like
idea of the race obvious. Of what's happening.
You're more focused. You've got a little more bandwidth to like be looking in the mirrors and like trying to take stuff in. But in these scenarios, there's so much that's happening immediately in front of you that's kind of the main thing. And to Marcus's point, like, I don't think it's worth belaboring in any particular sense, but I think it's fair enough, basically, that he certainly wouldn't have been thinking about it in the context of, that's Colton Herta, my teammate, who's leading the championship. Like, that's not context that you're concerning yourself with.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't get all of that. You wouldn't get to he's the championship leader, so you should think about the way that you're racing him differently for that reason, from a spotter
on a start as well.
And it sort of might require that you have that you are thinking about it in that context for to really treat the situation like a lot differently, like that. Like if I'm just putting myself in that situation, I'd probably need for somebody to tell me, like, that's a championship leader and it's your teammate, like, remind me of that, for me to kind of switch gears and be like, okay, I really need to not screw this up between the two of us. Because otherwise, on a race start or a restart, or even within a couple of laps of a race start, if it's still kind of all over the place, you're just racing against whoever you're racing against, kind of, and you're more or less treating everybody the same. So I think that's fairly typical. It's probably not the kind of thing, because even the idea that Colton's leading the championship, it's so early in the season that to me is kind of inconsequential at this point in terms of how you race guys like this early. Like, there's a lot of racing still to do before being the championship leader really matters.
Yeah, I guess don't hit your teammate is the golden rule. So irrelevant of the championship. Yeah,
exactly.
Lead, just don't get into your teammate, isn't it? All right. So I guess the only person who made up more positions than Colton Herta was Romain Grosjean, who had the opposite kind of race to Colton in the sense that he was overcutting, and I guess if he'd have waited 3 more laps before or after making his final pit stop, then he might have caught that caution like McLaughlin did and boosted himself into the top 10 as well, which would have been an incredible result from where he started way down the order. But I guess the interesting part of Romain Grosjean's race or weekend, I guess, was another expletive-filled back and two, this time with Santino Ferrucci. weird one, this, JR. I don't know how you kind of see this one. I found this weird on kind of multiple levels. I'll try to explain. The first one being that Santino had kind of waited until that he and Romain were together on track in the warm up for Indy road course, and his justification for the way he kind of bumped with Grosjean in that was that he wasn't happy with how he'd driven with him in the Barber warm up. So I'm kind of feeling like at this point, like too much time has gone between like Barber warm up and the Indy GP warm up, including a race and 2 practice sessions and a qualifying session, for that to be like something that is then like deemed as retribution for something. I kind of seen the lineage in Santino waiting for the next warm up session, but that's just kind of a weird way to approach like dishing out your beef in my opinion. But I kind of enjoyed and hated this on different levels. It was entertaining, at least from a neutral's perspective, that all of this was going on, and Santino was kind of like, come and see me if you're not happy with this, Romain, but this was your fault. And then in the pre-race, we had both of them saying bygones be bygones, basically, we're not worried about this. And then the first time they came together, there was contact between the two. But I think I would play the race contact down slightly, even though Romain was swearing about it on the radio, based on the fact that we've seen this at multiple Indy GP races, where if you go around the outside of that corner and you get pushed off, there is no penalty coming your way. Like, IndyCar do not judge that as a penalty. Whether you agree with that or not is your call. I can see it both ways personally. I think it's unfair to be pushed off the track at any corner personally, but I also see the argument that the kind of racing line is the inside, and that corner is just such that if you're on the inside, you are going to wash out to the exit because of how tight the corner is. So I kind of understand both elements of that, like why it's called a racing incident, because the car on the inside is naturally going to be forced out to the exit of the corner, and when cars get pushed off, that's kind of like, it's like whoever's leading into that corner has basically got the corner, and like if you're on the inside, you are the priority. So I didn't really, I don't agree with how that's policed, but in terms of knowing that is the case, like Santino didn't do a whole lot wrong there, because he's just going off the precedent that's been set previously. But I just found the whole kind of retribution come in like so long after Barber a little bit odd. And yeah, Romain just kind of like, well, Romain and Santino before the race both saying that it was over and then kind of getting into it again. Just a very odd kind of situation there. But I guess were you entertained from a neutral's perspective by the whole thing?
I was entertained by it. It all seems ridiculous to me. So I totally agree. Like, there's a lot of like double speak going on here, kind of like if Santino had an issue with Romain after warm up in Barber, then like he had an opportunity to squash that by going and talking to Romain about it at some point much earlier, rather than waiting until several sessions in I don't know, like it's a super weird kind of way of dealing with something like this. Like if you're going to wait till an on-track session, which is altogether like a dangerous and bad thing to do, so that should be a red flag for anybody at IndyCar. Like the fact that somebody was waiting until there was going to be an on-track situation to somehow dole out a little bit of like bump and grind or whatever is not the type of thing that we should be like saying is okay. So that I'll just flag as like an issue that probably deserves a little bit of attention. Not to mention like waiting through several sessions, like that seems very premeditated in a way that I also don't particularly like. I'm with you in terms of the actual what happened in the race. I think Santino's interview later on, I'll sort of take that at face value, which is that he would have done that to anybody, and I think most guys would have done that to anybody. Basically, we've seen that now at Indy GP and at Portland is the other track. I feel like that you see that in the corner that leads on to the back straight there. Like we saw that a couple of times in the race last year, that there's a couple of different ways that you can enter the corner, and so you end up in these kind of too wide situations, and the guy that's on the outside just gets shoved off basically, and nobody really seems to, have much issue with it. I think if you're racing somebody in these situations, if you're the aggressor, like you're the car that's making the pass and trying to make that pass by outbraking on the outside into one of these corners, I think basically the essence of it is that you need to be sort of like front axle ahead of the other driver's front axle at the apex at the same speed to the end of the corner. Like if you're that far ahead, then basically the other driver is going to have to drive into the side of you to push you off the track. Whereas in these situations, Santino's rolling across the apex. Romain's already kind of like halfway losing ground to him at that point. Once the inside car's front axle is ahead of the outside car's front axle, you're just going to drive out to the edge of the road. And to your point, there's been no reason for anybody to not do that, basically. So I think it just kind of ends up happening that I guess my point is, I think that could happen in any of these corners. That could happen in the previous corner that like goes through the S's and leads on to that little short straight, that bends across the alt start finish line or whatever. Could happen in turn 4, which leads on to the switchback onto the back straight. Any of those places, if you had the same situation happen where there's grass off the edge of a exit curbing, like I don't think anybody's getting penalties for doing that. And that's just, and I guess as long as race control is consistent about that, like I'm okay with that. Like that's just like good hard racing in areas of a track that probably aren't going to be over, it's not like super dangerous to end up in that situation.
I feel like, and I make zero apologies for this, that the last 8 Indy Road Course races have merged into one in my mind. So trying to pick out which one it is that I'm thinking is difficult. But I remember Newgarden being dumped off of that corner and being pretty upset about how he'd been raced and was tossed down the order. And at that point, he was quite championship focused, if I remember rightly, or it was significant in kind of what he was doing at the time. So, but yeah, I know there's precedent, like specifically at that corner for that being how that is policed. So, yeah, it's hard to feel sorry for Romain in that sense. It just felt like he was kind of like pushed over in the dark or something. Like it didn't really feel like he had a lot of like expectations of what was coming his way that weekend, and suddenly it was just like, oh, okay, so I'm kind of at war with another driver now. Like this is weird.
Unknowingly, yeah,
exactly. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that kind of beef that Santino says is over now. But whether Romain, I mean, I don't think Romain was too happy. I know he commented on an Instagram post saying no comment, and it doesn't feel like he'll let that go. The only one thing I wanted to add was I feel like we've had a few of these incidents in like warm-ups or practices where Romain is, for whatever reason, quite close to another car. Like if you go back and watch the video of where Santino touched Romain, which is I think turn 11, if I've got that right in my head, he's like quite, it looks like he's almost squeezing Santino down on like onto the inside of the like the curb of that corner. And I know he's not meaning to do that, but in hindsight, when you look back at some of these incidents where, like specifically with Romain in practices and warm-ups, like he's quite close to other cars when he probably doesn't need to be. And I get there's a lot of like fighting for position and traffic, all that kind of stuff is really important. But I just wonder if there's occasions where he could maybe just take the onus there and just be like, I've been in these situations before, it's not worked out well for me, I'm just going to back off here and move out of it. Maybe that's an unfair suggestion, but I do feel like Romain, of all people, is someone we've seen have this happen to them where they've had contact in pre-race practices or practices in general. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that Santino and Romain beef. I'm conscious we're running out of time, so we should get into the 500 a little bit. We should update the fact that the number 6 Aaron McLaren car will be driven by Callum Ilott. That has officially been announced, although it's like the worst kept secret in IndyCar. And I think we've said about 5 times on this podcast that he would be in the car for the past month and a half or so. But yeah, that's that car sorted. Interesting to see Callum back. Felt like he had a good start to his Indy 500 career in 2022, and then just made a small mistake in the race and crashed out, and then came back in 2023 where his like problems in the Hunkos team kind of started with Callum not feeling like the car was in the right window from the open test before they even got to May, and it wasn't really showing up clearly in the data, I don't think, what Callum was kind of feeling or what he was upset with. And it took them until Fast Friday to decide they were going to, just before qualifying to change the car and go to the backup car, and he immediately qualified it and then finished 12th in the race. So, which was Hunkos Hollander's best Indy 500 result at that time. So it's going to be interesting to see what it's like if he gets some more kind of, I mean, not to take anything away from Hunkos, but we're going into the month of May with 4 Arrow McLaren cars, 2 of which fought for the win last year. One of them was in the top 5. The other one probably could have been a little bit higher up with things going Tony Kanan's way a little bit more. But I think it's going to be interesting to see basically how Callum performs with kind of a little bit more of a sorted team with a little bit more behind him. So that'll be interesting to see. By now, you should be able to go to a full schedule of everything that's happening over the next 2 weeks on the-race.com. So go and check that out. We put a little description in for a lot of the days as well. So if you're unsure of what like bump day means or fast Friday or any of these kind of terms, carb day, there's a little explainer to say kind of what happens on that day and why you should watch it, why you should be interested in it. So hopefully that helps kind of get through all of that. We've got a new tyre for the race. That's going to be an interesting thing to watch as part of the practice build up in terms of news. And one final thing that I haven't had your thoughts on yet, JR, was the news that 4 people have been suspended for Team Penske in light of the whole disqualifications at St. Pete from the push to pass situation. We ran through it on the last week's show in terms of the news, but I wanted to get a driver's perspective of, I mean, I'm sure this has not happened to you where you've lost your race engineer and your data engineer a matter of weeks before the Indy 500. But if you can put yourself back in the shoes of heading into a month of May as a driver and what you think that might do for how your month will kind of play out, just kind of like losing your race engineer and your data engineer. And we know that Josef will have familiar people on the car, like whoever takes over those roles is going to be familiar, and it's probably going to be the same people that did Indy GP with him. So I mean, that's fine. He'll know the people, but those aren't people like Tim Cindric and Luke Mason, and not people you just kind of like pluck off the production line. So I'm kind of keen to get your thoughts about how you think that might impact Josef and how big an effect that might have.
I think on the surface of it, like on a broad day-to-day, what can they accomplish? Kind of, just in terms of what they do when they're at the track, it's probably because they'll be in communication remotely. There's those kinds of things. They, probably doesn't have like a massive impact. Like if the cars roll off the truck fast, they, somebody else can probably keep them pretty fast and keep them in the window, and they can rely a little bit more heavily on some of the guys on the other timing stands and whatever else. They can rely on Bretzman and Faustino and Will and Scott, whatever. There's other, the benefit of being Team Penske is that you do have a lot of high performing people within that organization. But in my mind, like the only relevant like experience that I have with this is, when I was racing for ECR before I was full time there, it was always as an extra car at a really good team. So car prep for my car was always as good as it was for the other guys, like all the kind of stuff. But I was as the extra guy, you were kind of ending up with not necessarily a lower performing group of people or something, but just a different group of people, like group of people who were maybe not used to being in that particular role or, whatever. So if I have any analogous experience, it's probably something like that you're just kind of, you don't have the main guys that are just typically doing that thing. And so you end up in a situation where sometimes it doesn't really make any, like I said, if you roll off the truck fast and you get through, if you're first time you go into qualifying trim, like everything's good. And you don't have to like be making a lot of split second decisions in terms of, should we, the weather's changing while we're in the qualifying line. And so we've got to like do a little this or that to try to tweak for that. Then it maybe doesn't like manifest itself in like the strength of the team is enough that you're not really at like an obvious disadvantage. If it's anything other than that, though, like if the cars are not great in some particular, capacity, or you're getting unexpected performance, cars aren't as fast as you thought they were going to be once you got into race trim or into qualifying trim. The balance isn't quite where you need it. The tire is different, and so some of the things that you've worked on like don't end up really translating. And then I mentioned just the qualifying scenario. The reality of it is that so if I was, and we could talk about this later on, but we might not do a pod, I guess, before qualifying. So I'll just talk about the way that you prep for that and kind of what's important to be thinking about even from the beginning of the week is that the best chance that more likely than not, the odds are very good. The best chance you're going to have to lay down the fattest number that you can lay down is on the first run that you make, because it's going to be the earliest in the day. So particularly if you're in like the first half of the cars that go out for the first run, that's when you've got the best chance of cooler track temps that you may not get back until like the end of the day. And by the end of the day, you're kind of getting into cars trying to make their way back into the field and using up the two lines, basically like going into the fast lane. In terms of the way that the whole qualifying situation works. So I think most of our listeners will know this, but basically you'll end up with two lanes to go back out on track. One is a low risk lane where you don't actually pull your time and you just get to go back out and try again kind of as much as you want. But there's also a high risk, the fast lane, as we kind of all call it within the industry or within the sport, that once you pull the car into that line, you've pulled your time, but you go straight to the front of the line and you will go out ahead of any of the cars in the slow lane. And so you get to a point in the day, usually once the temperatures start to cool off, that if there is bumping that's happening, cars will start filling that lane. So anybody who's kind of solidly in the field, it's a fairly significant risk to switch gears and like pull your time unless you are like positive that you are going to go out and go faster. And so I bring that up basically just to say that what all of that comes back to is what all of that comes back to is usually the best conditions are going to be that first run that you make, and that the car is the coolest during that first run. Once you make a qualifying run, it's very difficult to get the car cooled back down adequately to make it so that when you go back through the tech line, that the cold fuel that goes in the car, like cold fuel in the car for a qualifying run, is worth some horsepower. Once the car has done a qualifying run, it's very hard to get just the whole car to cool, but the engine, everything else to cool back down enough that once you put that cold fuel back in to make another run, that doesn't kind of immediately just come up to the temperature of the rest of the car. And so those are like a few of the little nuances that sort of make it such that it's really important to establish what you can do and to try to kind of like hit your ceiling of what's possible for you in your with your squad in that car for that first run. Like stuff like that is harder to do when you don't have like your normal group of people that have sort of just like a more innate understanding of how to read between the lines of what each other is kind of saying, what your feedback is, all that kind of stuff. So, my feeling about this whole thing is that there's a little room for the two team just generally to not be quite at the level that they would otherwise be at just day to day. There's going to be, it's not just having somebody different over the radio. It's talking to somebody different, who's the strategist who on the timing stand about where you want to end up in the group of cars that's currently out on track, and them like having the same kind of thought process for how they're going to stick you in that hole. There's like all of these little things that are not just that don't just come down to deciding when you're going to pit for fuel on race day or deciding what setup to put on the car, when you go out on track. That is kind of communication that's constantly happening between the strategist, the lead engineer, sometimes another engineer, and the driver. So I guess I would chalk that all up basically to saying like there is definitely room for that to be suboptimal in terms of actually just getting through everything. I know I felt like at times that when I was the third car at ECR, that even though I knew the car was fast and I knew that like by the time we got to the end of the day, if we didn't like really have our shit together, that like we'd have time to reset and regroup with whatever Ed was doing or whatever Josef was doing with their teams or something if we needed to. It's easier to end up kind of feeling like you're in no man's land along the way. And so that, we talked to Josef after he won the race last year. Like he basically said that they like had a great car at the beginning and then screwed around with it for no reason, more or less, for the entire month. And then finally just went back to it on, Fast Friday. So it's not to say that any of that necessarily matters in terms of where they end up going into race day or how they can perform on race day, but it definitely makes getting through the entire rest of the practice and qualifying situations different, to say the least.
I was going to raise that point because, I mean, what if another engineer isn't as in tune with Josef and they kind of keep going down this rabbit warren of different setups, and they maybe stick with something that they come across and don't go back to that original setup that they got? I feel like that's a significant journey that they went on, and the fact that they went back to that original setup was maybe it was an obvious one that anyone would have made, but also maybe it took a bit of nuts to say, actually, I think what we had first was best, and the trust between driver and engineer coming to that conclusion and saying, actually, that's where we're better off going, even though we've done all of this work over the 5 day or 4 days to try and get to this point. So I'm really interested to see how that plays out for Josef. Obviously very upsetting for him to have had all of this go on, the disqualification at St. Pete, and then to lose his strategist, his race engineer, and his data engineer as well, going into the defense of his Indy 500, and I guess Roger Penske as well, hampering himself to a certain extent in looking for that 20th Indy 500 win. So it's going to be such an interesting couple of weeks to see how all that plays out. Let's give you a rundown. JR gave you an excellent kind of insight into what qualifying is like there. Let's give you a quick rundown of the schedule. So Tuesday will be practice pretty much all day. Starts at 9 a.m. local, runs till 6. There'll be some different stuff going on there with I don't know the exact schedule with kind of like veterans and refreshers and all of that nonsense. I think we've got all of that out of the way actually, but if there's any need for any of that kind of stuff, it'll happen in the morning, and then the afternoon session is usually like a full-on practice session. Wednesday, Thursday also just kind of general practices, 12 till 6. The Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is interesting in the sense that the teams all kind of work on a mixture of race setup and qualifying setup as well. They'll also spend a lot of time trying to predict what the car's doing in different conditions, because even like 1 degree of track temp can have a massive impact in terms of when you're qualifying. So they'll be doing that. In terms of race running, they'll be trying to run in packs as much as they can to try and simulate what the car is like over a longer stint in the race, simulate tyre wear as well, and make sure that the car's drivable for that whole stint. And then Friday, May 17th is Fast Friday, which is where the teams get the extra qualifying boost that they'll receive in qualifying on Saturday and Sunday. So they get to practice basically for a full day with that extra boost to make sure they're in the right window. We'll still see some teams do practice, sort of like qualifying practice Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but it'll be less frequent, and we'll see more of that on the Friday when they get that extra boost. Saturday is a full day of qualifying. The order that the drivers go in will be decided by a draw on the Friday. So it's basically drawn at random. Then everyone will qualify, and then once everyone's qualified, they'll go into the lines that JR described a minute or so ago. And then Sunday is bump day. We'll have the top 12 qualifying, so that'll be the top 12 that come through from Saturday, they'll be whittled down to a Fast 6, and that Fast 6 will go for pole later in the day. We'll also have last chance qualifying that day, where either 1 or 2 cars will be bumped out, I guess, depending on what happens with Able Motorsport. The last I've heard on that is that they're not going to attempt the race, but that could change. And at this point, who knows? We'll wait and see. That one's been a kind of weird up and down story, in and out for pretty much a few months now. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that. There's also, after that, all of that happening, on the Monday, May 20th, we'll hopefully have a pod with a pole sitter. That's what we usually do. There'll be a practice that day as well, 1 till 3. And then nothing on track until Friday, which is carb day, which is 11 till 1 practice, and then 2:30 till 4 is the pit stop challenge. That's a big deal for all of the teams. They're making hundreds of pit stops over the course of the month of May, and there's massive bragging rights about who wins the pit stop challenge. Even the personnel even get their own press conference afterwards, so that's pretty cool to get to speak to them. It's probably one time of the year where we actually get to speak to some of the pit crews, which is really interesting. Massively unsung element of winning Indy 500 is how good your pit crew are, so it'll be interesting to see how they get on. And the race is Sunday, 1:15, green flag roughly. Make sure you tune in before that, wherever you're watching, to get all the pomp and ceremony and all of that brilliant stuff that happens before the Indy 500. So yeah, that's a rundown of your schedule. JR's give you a great idea of what to expect from qualifying. I think I've hopefully summed up roughly what happens in practice, so that'll give you an idea of that. And yeah, make sure you head to the-race.com for all of your latest news and features. Check out our back catalogue. You can listen to some retro episodes that we've done, as well as some of the more contemporary ones. You can also go back and listen to our pole episode with Alex Palou last year, and our winning driver episode with Josef Newgarden last year, and obviously we've done that in previous years as well. So the likes of Scott Dixon also appearing on the show in previous years as well, and Marcus Ericsson, of course. So go back and check those out. JR, have a safe journey to Indy when you eventually go. Make sure your phone's on silent. Don't answer it to any team owners, because they're just going to get your hopes up, and God, they're mean, those team owners, JR. They're super mean. They just keep dangling this carrot in front of you and not giving you the drive. So we need to do something about that before next year, because this is, as much as I like speaking to you, it's getting too much. We need to get you in the race.
Take that. I'll, definitely keen to get back on the horse, and, be worth it to be out there just to go cruise around and check it out for a little bit. It's
either that, guys, or JR's going to be driving a Mitsubishi Pajero on the salt lakes of Bonneville or something. It's this competitive or just like energy for motorsport is going to have to come out in some way, shape or form that isn't driving an IndyCar. So I'm actually kind of excited. And you've obviously got the NASCAR in the background as well, which you haven't talked about for a while, but I know you said you've been doing some work on that recently. So hopefully we'll see that out before the end of the year as well.
Yeah, definitely before the end of the year. Got the engine builders sorted. Got some crates full of Gen 6 NASCAR stuff from Trackhouse that they just they sent. So be the fastest 1999 NASCAR car ever. But yeah, no, it's shaping up to be a good time in my spare time, at least.
Just make sure you don't Hail Melon it and smash it around a wall or something after you put all of those nice Trackhouse expensive Gen 6 parts into it. Thanks, JR, for all of your insight as always. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Make sure to check out, as I said, our back catalogue and the-race.com. You can also check out And Colossally, That's History, our new history podcast with the race, which has just looked into some Indy 500s in the past with Matt Bishop and Richard Williams, including Alonso's 2017 bid that Matt Bishop was part of, and also Richard Williams was there for Mansell in 93 and 94. So that's a cool look back into the history of the Indy 500. It's a bit leaning towards some of the European teams that have gone over and attempted it, admittedly, but it does also get into the history of the 500 as well. So I'd definitely recommend going to check out that podcast as well. That's all for this week's episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.